Chapter 1. A Voice in the Dark. Arav stepped out of his car, gazing at the small, weathered cabin nestled deep within the thick forest. The air was cool, and silence hung heavily around him, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Tall trees encircled the cabin, their branches twisting upward like skeletal arms reaching for the gray sky. The isolation here was almost overwhelming, but that was exactly what he wanted. He needed quiet, he told himself, someplace away from the world where he could finish his latest book and escape from everything he'd left behind. The cabin had once belonged to his grandmother. Arav hadn't been back here since he was a child, and even then, his visits had been rare. He remembered her stories about this place, her warnings, spoken in a voice half serious and half playful, about how the cabin held memories too old to forget and too deep to escape. She had always said it with a strange expression, a mix of fondness and sorrow, as if this place both comforted and unsettled her. Arav hadn't understood her then, but he did now. There were things in life that lingered, things you thought you'd buried but somehow kept resurfacing, like echoes bouncing off the walls of memory. He pushed the thoughts away, determined not to dwell on the past. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to finally focus on his writing without distraction. After settling in, he decided to call it an early night. The day had been long, and he was exhausted. He lay on the small bed, its old, creaky frame groaning under his weight. Closing his eyes, he listened to the sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind in the trees. But just as he was about to drift off, he heard something strange, a faint sound, barely perceptible, like a voice murmuring his name. Arav. He opened his eyes, his body tensing as he listened, holding his breath. The sound faded into the night, and he quickly dismissed it as a trick of his tired mind. He was in an unfamiliar place, alone and exhausted. It was easy for the imagination to conjure things that weren't there. Shaking his head, he closed his eyes again, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. But just as he was beginning to relax, he heard it again, this time closer, more distinct. Arav. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was a sorrow in it that sent a chill down his spine. His eyes flew open, his heart pounding. This wasn't his imagination. He sat up, scanning the dark room, his eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. The cabin was small, a single room with a tiny kitchen in one corner and a couple of wooden chairs near a dusty fireplace. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, yet the voice had felt so real, as if someone were standing right there, whispering to him in the dark. And what disturbed him most was the familiarity of it, as though he knew the voice, or it knew him. It echoed around him, filling the room with a lingering sadness that made his chest tighten. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was nothing. But the cabin felt different now, as if it were alive, holding its breath, waiting. A cold, heavy silence filled the air, pressing down on him, making him feel small and vulnerable. He lay back down, pulling the blankets up to his chin like a child trying to ward off a nightmare, but sleep would not come. As the hours passed, he lay there, haunted by the voice and the sorrow it carried. The silence grew thicker, as though the walls themselves were grieving, sharing a sorrow that had been locked away for too long. Arav thought of his grandmother's warnings, her strange expression whenever she spoke of this place. Was this what she had meant? Had she known something about this cabin that she hadn't told him? In the darkness, his mind wandered back to his childhood, to memories he'd tried to forget. He remembered his mother, her soft voice, her sad eyes, the way she'd sing him to sleep when he was young. She'd been taken from him too soon, leaving a void in his life that had never truly healed. Coming to this cabin, he'd hoped to escape the pain of those memories, to lose himself in his writing. But it seemed that here, in this lonely, haunted place, the past had found him once again. The night stretched on, and still, he couldn't sleep. The voice had faded, but its presence lingered, like a shadow clinging to him. He felt as though he were not alone, as if the cabin itself held something within its walls, some secret it was trying to share with him, or perhaps a grief it needed him to bear. By dawn, he was exhausted, his mind filled with questions he couldn't answer. What was this voice? Why did it feel so familiar, so heartbreakingly sad? He thought of leaving, of abandoning the cabin and returning to the safety of the city. But something held him back, a strange compulsion to stay, to understand the sorrow that had reached out to him in the night. He rose from the bed, glancing around the room with weary eyes. The cabin was silent once more, its dark corners softened by the morning light. Yet the air was still heavy, charged with something he couldn't explain, something that felt like a memory waiting to be uncovered. Arav took a deep breath, steeling himself. He didn't know what awaited him here, but he knew one thing: he could not leave, not yet. Something in this cabin was calling to him, reaching out from the shadows. And despite his fear, despite the sorrow that clung to the walls like an unspoken lament, he knew he had to stay. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The second night at the cabin was colder. Arav bundled himself in an old quilt he'd found in the closet, trying to shake off the lingering chill. The previous night's strange occurrences haunted him. He had spent the entire day telling himself it had all been in his head, just his imagination stirred by exhaustion. But as the darkness settled around the cabin again, his mind refused to rest. The hours passed slowly. The small clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each sound unnervingly loud in the silence. Arav lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, too restless to sleep. Shadows danced across the room, cast by the branches swaying outside. Just as he was beginning to relax, he sensed something, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. He could feel it, a presence in the room, as though someone else was there with him. He turned his head slowly and saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the room, cloaked in darkness. His heart raced, pounding against his chest. He froze, his breath caught, every instinct telling him to move, to scream, to run. But he couldn't. It was as if the figure held him there, paralyzed under its gaze. The figure was silent, almost blending into the shadows, yet its presence was undeniable, thick and suffocating. There was something deeply sorrowful about it, a sadness that seemed to fill the room, wrapping around him like a cold shroud. Arav could feel the weight of it, an emotion so intense it was almost painful. He looked away, squeezing his eyes shut, his hands clutching the quilt as if it could somehow protect him. When he finally gathered the courage to open his eyes again, the figure was gone. The room was empty, still, but the air was heavy with an unshakable sadness, as if the walls themselves were grieving. Arav lay in bed, feeling as if he had been invaded, as if the figure's sorrow had somehow seeped into him, clinging to him like a memory he couldn't shake. The morning light brought little comfort. The cabin felt darker now, weighed down by an unseen presence. Arav knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to understand what was happening, to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and unease, he began searching the cabin, hoping to find answers. After hours of searching, his eyes landed on an old, dusty bookshelf pushed against the wall. It seemed out of place in the small room, and a strange feeling pulled him toward it. He ran his hands along the edges, feeling for anything unusual. And there it was, a small, hidden door behind the shelf, barely noticeable. Arav's heart raced as he struggled to move the bookshelf aside, revealing the door fully. It was old, the wood worn and splintered, with a rusted lock hanging from it. He remembered his grandmother's words, her cryptic warnings about the cabin and its secrets. Perhaps this was what she had meant. He tried the lock, but it wouldn't budge. After a few minutes of searching, he found an old hammer and pried it open, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were lined with faded photographs. Dozens of them, each one carefully framed, as if someone had wanted to preserve these memories. Arav stepped inside, his eyes scanning the images. They were mostly of a young woman, her expression soft yet tinged with sadness. She looked so familiar, almost as if he knew her, or should know her. Then he saw it, the photograph that made his breath catch. It was of the young woman standing beside a little boy, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The boy had dark eyes, messy hair, and a shy smile. Arav's heart hammered as he realized the boy was him. Memories flooded back, fragments of a past he had buried deep within him. The woman in the photo was his mother. He remembered her now, her gentle smile, her sad eyes that always seemed to carry a hidden pain. She had taken him to this cabin only once or twice, and even as a child, he had sensed her sadness, though he hadn't understood it then. He reached out, touching the photograph, a pang of sorrow piercing his chest. How had he forgotten this place? Why had he buried these memories? And why had his mother kept these photos hidden away, locked behind a door as if they were something to be feared? He continued looking around, noticing small trinkets and personal items scattered around the room. A scarf that still smelled faintly of her perfume, a bracelet she used to wear, a small wooden box filled with letters. It was as though a part of her had remained here, preserved in this secret space, waiting to be found. Arav sank to the floor, overwhelmed. He felt a strange mixture of grief and guilt, as if he had abandoned her, left her here in this lonely place. He thought about the voice he had heard, the sorrowful whisper calling his name in the dark. It had been her, reaching out to him, a mother's spirit bound to this place, waiting for him to remember her. Arav spent hours in that small room, piecing together fragments of memories, lost moments of love and sorrow. He realized now that the cabin was more than just a place to escape. It was a place filled with memories too deep to ignore, memories that had called him back, refusing to let him forget. As night fell, he returned to the main room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The shadows felt different now, less menacing but filled with a profound sadness. He understood that he couldn't leave, not yet. There was something here that needed him, a pain that had lingered in silence, waiting for someone to listen. And Arav, with a heart full of sorrow and resolve, knew that he was finally ready to listen. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Promise. The discovery of his mother's hidden room weighed heavily on Arav's mind. It was as if he'd unlocked not just a door, but a part of his past that he'd long forgotten, buried under years of grief and silence. Memories swirled around him, fragments of a childhood shadowed by loss, mingling with the voices and whispers that seemed to haunt the cabin. That night, as he sat alone in the dim light of the cabin, he felt a deep ache, a yearning that gnawed at him from within. He realized he was not only uncovering his mother's past but his own as well. As he sat in the living room, the silence of the cabin pressed in around him. The fire in the small hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The familiar sorrow returned, wrapping around him like a cold embrace. Arav tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, grounding himself in the present, but the feeling was relentless. He could almost sense her presence beside him, a figure just out of sight, waiting in the shadows. Then, in the quiet, he heard it, a voice, soft and broken, calling his name. Arav. His heart thudded, and he turned, his eyes searching the room. There was no one there, only the quiet crackle of the fire and the shadows dancing on the walls. But the voice continued, carrying a weight of grief and love, like a long-lost lullaby. Arav, you promised. Don't leave me alone. The words sliced through him, pulling memories from the depths of his heart. He remembered his mother's voice, how she used to whisper to him softly, tucking him into bed, the way her voice held both love and sadness. And now, hearing it echo in this place, he felt a pang of regret, as if he had forgotten something important, something he had promised her long ago. The pain in her voice brought him back to his childhood, to the quiet nights he had spent by her side, sensing the unspoken sadness that filled her eyes. He had been too young to understand back then, but he could remember the promise she had made him repeat. You won't forget me, right? You'll always keep me close. He whispered into the silence, his voice trembling. I'm here, Ma. I didn't forget you. I just didn't remember. A flood of memories rushed over him. Images of her gentle smile, the way she would hum softly as she braided his hair, her fingers light but sure. He remembered feeling safe with her, wrapped in her warmth, as if nothing could ever touch him. But he had also felt her sadness, like a shadow that lingered behind every smile. She had hidden it from him, but he had sensed it, even as a child. He rose from his seat, drawn by an inexplicable urge. His footsteps echoed softly as he returned to the small hidden room. The air felt heavier here, as if every object carried a weight of memory. He approached the small wooden chest he had found earlier, its surface dusty but sturdy. Inside, he found her journal, a faded blue notebook filled with pages of her handwriting. He had never seen it before, but somehow it felt familiar, like something he had once held as a child. He opened it, his eyes scanning the words, her thoughts, her dreams, and, most heartbreakingly, her loneliness. Each entry revealed pieces of her heart, a mother trying to protect her son from her own sorrow, a woman struggling to find peace in a world that seemed to offer her none. She had written about her dreams for him, her fears of leaving him alone, and her desperate hope that he would remember her, that he would find solace even if she couldn't. One entry, written in shaky handwriting, caught his attention. Arav, my precious boy, I know I won't always be here. But I want you to know that you are my heart, my hope, my everything. I'm sorry for the sadness I carry, but I can't let it go. If I can't find peace, promise me that you will. Promise me you'll remember me, that you'll keep me close, even if only in your heart. Asterisk. Tears blurred his vision as he read her words. It was as if she had known she wouldn't stay, that one day she would leave him, and all that would remain were her memories, locked away in this hidden room. He could feel her presence beside him, a faint warmth, as if her spirit lingered, bound to the promise she had asked of him. Arav closed the journal, his heart aching with love and regret. He whispered into the empty room, his voice choked with emotion, "Ma, I'm here. I remember now. I'm sorry it took me so long, but I won't leave you alone." The cabin fell silent, but it was a different silence, one filled with peace rather than sorrow, as if her spirit had heard him, finally reassured. For the first time since he had arrived, Arav felt a strange calm wash over him, a warmth that softened the sadness lingering in his heart. He understood now why he had been drawn back to this place, why his mother's voice had called to him from the shadows. She had been waiting, holding on to the promise he'd made and then forgotten. That night, he sat by the fire, the journal open on his lap, his fingers tracing the lines of her handwriting. He could feel her presence, a gentle warmth beside him, a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember her fully, to feel her love, her sorrow, her hopes, all of it, everything she had left behind. In the quiet hours before dawn, Arav whispered one last promise into the silence. "I'll carry you with me, Ma. Always." Chapter 4. Confronting the Pain. Arav sat in the dim light of the cabin, his mother's journal clutched in his hands. The weight of her sorrow was heavy, pressing down on him as if it were his own. The entries revealed a side of her he had never known, a young woman trapped in a cycle of loneliness and guilt, carrying a burden that even he, her only child, hadn't been able to relieve. Her words painted a picture of her isolation, her struggle to find peace, and a love so deep that it was intertwined with pain. For years, Arav had wondered why she seemed so sad, why she often gazed out the window as if searching for something. Now, he understood. Determined to understand the full story, Arav continued to sift through her belongings. He found an old wooden chest in the corner of the small room, covered with dust but still sturdy. Inside were her favorite shawl, a few trinkets, and a stack of letters, each one carefully folded, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. As he untied it and unfolded the first letter, he noticed it was addressed to him, though she had never sent it. "My dear Arav," it began in her delicate handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, as if she had written it through tears. "I know I haven't always been the mother you deserve. My heart has been heavy for so long, burdened by regrets I couldn't shake. But I want you to know how much I love you, how much light you brought into my life even on my darkest days. I'm sorry for the sadness you must have seen in me. I never wanted it to affect you, but I know it did. Forgive me, my sweet boy." Arav's eyes blurred with tears as he read her words, each one a confession of her sorrow and guilt. There were more letters, each revealing fragments of her story, a failed relationship, her struggles with family expectations, the constant fear of leaving him alone in the world. She had written these words as if preparing for the day when she wouldn't be there to say them, a last attempt to explain her absence in his life. One letter in particular caught his eye, its tone different from the rest. It spoke of a promise, a vow she had made to herself to always be there for him, even if she couldn't physically be present. "Arav, if you're reading this, know that I'm still with you. I can't bear the thought of you being alone, of you forgetting me. I need you to remember, to hold me close, even if I'm only a memory. It's the only way I can rest, the only way my spirit can be at peace. Promise me, my love, that you'll keep me with you." The words struck him like a thunderbolt. She had clung to him, even beyond death, her spirit lingering in this cabin, waiting for him to remember her, to fulfill a promise he hadn't realized he'd made. She had been bound here, her sorrow holding her to this place, unable to leave until he came back to confront the memories they shared. Arav took a shaky breath, her final words filling him with an aching sadness. He could feel her spirit now, not as a distant presence but as something close, hovering in the air around him. It was as if she were sitting beside him, her hand on his shoulder, waiting for him to understand her fully, to accept the love she had left behind, entwined with her grief. He whispered into the silence, his voice breaking, "Ma, I understand. I'm here. I'm not leaving you alone. I remember everything now." His words felt like a release, as if he were finally giving her permission to rest, to let go of the pain she had carried all these years. But even as he spoke, he realized there was still something unfinished. His mother had lived with a sense of unfulfilled dreams, an isolation that had never left her, even as she loved him. Her journal, her letters, they were only parts of her story, fragments of a life that had been heavy with regrets and missed chances. He returned to the journal, flipping through its pages until he found an entry written in shaky handwriting, the ink faded as if it had been touched many times. "Sometimes I wish I could have stayed longer, shown him more love, given him the life he deserved. But this cabin, these memories, they're all I have left to give him. If only he knew how much he means to me." Arav closed the journal, feeling the weight of her love and her loneliness wrap around him like a shroud. She had lived her life believing she had failed him, believing she could never give him enough. He thought of all the moments she had been there for him in her own quiet way, the small acts of love she had shown, even when she was struggling with her own pain. He whispered into the empty room, "You gave me everything, Ma. I didn't forget. I won't forget." The air grew warmer, the weight of sorrow lifting slightly, as if his words had brought her a measure of peace. For the first time, he felt a true calm settling over him, a sense that the grief he had carried for so long was finally easing. He sat there for hours, watching the fire flicker and die down, letting himself feel both the pain and the love that had defined his relationship with her. As dawn approached, Arav rose, placing the journal and letters back in the chest, carefully preserving her memories, her words. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could carry her story forward, keeping her memory alive in his heart. She had left him with a legacy of love and resilience, and now it was his turn to honor it, to ensure that her spirit could finally rest. In the quiet light of morning, Arav stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the trees. He felt a warmth beside him, a presence that was no longer bound by sorrow. She was free now, her spirit at peace, and he knew she would always be with him, no longer a ghost, but a gentle memory that would guide him through the rest of his life. Chapter 5. The Farewell. The cabin was bathed in the soft glow of dawn, the early light filtering through the window and casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Arav felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The grief, once an ache buried so deep he had forgotten its roots, now lay in the open, raw but strangely comforting. He had spent the night reliving memories and piecing together the life his mother had left behind, understanding her in a way he never had before. Her presence, which had once felt so haunting, now filled the cabin with warmth. As he moved through the small room, now no longer a place of secrets but of stories and love, he sensed a gentle pull leading him back to the heart of the cabin. The silence, once oppressive and heavy, now felt like a quiet invitation, a sacred space where he and his mother could finally say goodbye. He sat by the fireplace, the embers still faintly glowing, and closed his eyes. As he sat in the silence, he felt her presence beside him, no longer the shadowed figure he'd glimpsed in the dark corners but a comforting, loving warmth. In his mind's eye, he saw her face as he remembered it best. Soft, kind eyes, a gentle smile, the look of someone who had carried both love and sorrow in equal measure. "Ma," he whispered, his voice breaking. In the quiet, he felt her answer, not in words but in a feeling, a sense of peace, of forgiveness, of love that had transcended all the years and distance. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, for him to understand her fully, to feel not only her pain but the depths of her love. He remembered her last words, written in her journal, her wish that he would remember her and hold her close even if she was gone. She had wanted to leave something behind for him, a piece of herself, so he would never feel alone. And in that moment, he understood that this cabin, these memories, were her way of keeping her promise, of ensuring he knew he was loved. He opened his eyes and looked around the cabin. The small room with its old photographs, her letters, her journal, they were all pieces of her heart, fragments of her spirit that she had woven into this place. He understood now that she had never meant for him to find only sorrow here. She had hoped he would find her love, her devotion, the essence of everything she had been to him. He took a deep breath and, for the last time, addressed the room. "Ma, I'm ready to let you go. Thank you for waiting, for holding on until I could find my way back to you. I'll carry you with me, but I want you to rest now." As the words left his lips, a sense of release filled the room, like the lifting of a long-held breath. The air grew warm, and for a moment, he felt her presence beside him, not as a shadow but as something pure and radiant. It was as if she were embracing him, a final gesture of love that lingered in the quiet morning. In his heart, he felt her respond, a sense of deep gratitude and peace, as though she was finally free from the sadness that had bound her to this place. She was leaving, but she was leaving him with a part of herself that he could carry forever, a love that would guide him long after she was gone. Slowly, he rose from his seat, feeling lighter than he had in years. He gathered her journal and letters, placing them carefully back in the chest, a small shrine to her memory. He wanted to leave this place as he had found it, undisturbed, her story preserved within its walls. As he stepped outside, the morning sun bathed the forest in a golden light, illuminating the trees and the path that led away from the cabin. He paused at the door, looking back one last time. The cabin, once a place of mystery and sorrow, now felt like a home, a place where he had finally come to understand his mother and himself. He whispered a final goodbye, feeling the peace that had settled within him. The memories of his mother, her love and her pain, would always be with him, but he knew they would no longer haunt him. Instead, they would serve as a source of strength, a reminder of the love that had transcended life itself. As he walked down the path, the cabin grew smaller in the distance, but he felt no sadness, only a quiet gratitude. He had come seeking an escape from his past, and instead, he had found a way to heal it, to understand the woman who had loved him with all her heart and, in her own way, had never truly left him. Days later, when he returned to the city, Arav poured himself into his writing, his work now filled with a depth he hadn't known before. He completed his book, dedicating it to her, a tribute to her love, her struggles, and the promise he had finally kept. And though he was far from the cabin, every now and then, in the quiet hours of the night, he felt her presence, a gentle reminder that she was still with him, watching over him, her spirit now at peace. Through his words, he ensured her memory would live on, not as a ghost, but as a lasting echo of love, a reminder that no bond, not even death, could truly erase the connection they shared.